We may have successfully averted a crisis. I'm not sure yet. Because you see, my milkman is here right now. I have a milkman. It's actually a company called the Modern Milkman, which seems to me in this day and age, like on the one hand, it should be called the Modern Milk Person, right? You just can't assume that the milkman's going to be a man. On the other hand, I can understand why you wouldn't want to have a company called the Modern Milk Person. Anyway, the problem with that is that Declan, the dog, this is only our second week having a milkman, and he's not entirely convinced that this is a benign process. So he was barking a lot a few minutes ago. I think things have calmed down, is what I'm saying. UN peacekeepers have arrived. All right. So I think the theme today is going to be shortages. We are going to talk first to Roger Cohen, who often joins us. He's from the New York Times, where he runs the Paris bureau. And writes wonderful columns. He's also the author of several books, including his family memoir, The Girl from Human Street, Ghosts of Memory in a Jewish Family, about a shortage of decency, which perhaps is going to be corrected right now. We'll also be talking about a shortage of vaccines or the things needed to complete logistical delivery of vaccines. And then lastly, because you haven't endured enough shortages from toilet paper to pepperoni, there's apparently a potential shortage of Christmas trees because people want them. They want to be cheered up. So here we go, all of the above. And we're going to begin, as I say, with Roger Cohen from the New York Times, who indeed wrote a piece called A Return to Decency in the New York Times. Sheer scarcity has made decency, which is ordinarily kind of a bland dish, seem like a very rich and highly desirable pudding. And according to Roger, maybe we'll get some of it back. Some of it may still elude us. Roger Cohen, welcome back to our show.
Thank you, Colin.
So, yes, as Joe Biden was first claiming the Democratic nomination, I was in the habit of saying that I wasn't necessarily excited about a Biden presidency, but I was excited, and for once my predictive skills actually worked. I was excited about a Ron Klain chief of staff. The idea that you'd have sort of competent people in there actually knew how to run the government and liked government enough to want to run it well. But as you point out, it's really more than that. It's that, are we going to participate as a decent part of Western civilization in the lattice work of Western democracies when we get Biden in the White House? And what are your thoughts?
Well, Colin, I think we've got a good shot at it. You never know, but I personally think we averted a pretty dangerous disaster in electing Joe Biden to be president and not re-electing President Donald Trump. I think Trump, whatever else you may think of him, has shown an indecent degree of self-obsession. He has shown an indecent readiness to employ several members of his family in clearly nepotistic practice, working in some of the most influential positions in the country. He's completely abandoned, in an indecent way, American support for what I consider to be our core values, including freedom, democracy, human rights. I think every dictator across the world, with the possible exception of Xi Jinping, be it Putin, be it Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, be it Duterte in the Philippines, I think they felt completely at home with the Trump presidency. They felt they had carte blanche. President Sisi in Egypt, pretty much without exception, whereas democratic leaders, part of that lattice work of democracies that we built up since 1945, like, for example, Angela Merkel in Germany, felt very uncomfortable with Donald Trump. So I think we could turn a corner now. I think we're going to get competent people in high office. He's already nominated Tony Blinken as Secretary of State, among others. And I think Joe Biden himself is a decent man. I have 4 children. He had 4 children. He lost 2 of them. That is a tremendous heartbreaking loss that he has overcome. And I think it has given him, along with 45 plus years of political experience, a fundamental understanding of the dilemmas and challenges of being a human being and of having a decent society.
Yeah, I think we almost can't. It would be impossible to overstate the significance of Joe Biden's intense familiarity, repeated more than once in his life, with extreme tragedy. I think it does alter a person, and I think it'll be interesting and at times hopefully inspiring to see what that means for him as president. Meanwhile, the person currently occupying the White House, rather than being familiar with tragedy, is a tragedy. And I know that and very specifically, your colleague Peter Baker, writing about him this weekend, in fact, rather than looking for any analogies in American history or public life or anything like that, went straight to Shakespeare, said, is he Julius Caesar? I would say, if so, we are very short on Brutuses here. We need a few more in the Republican Party. Is he Richard III? Is he King Lear? The only other place that he really was going to was to people like Putin, to Eastern European despots. There's a way in which that is an indication of something you point out in your article too, how much we veered out of our old lane. We have temporarily become a country that resembles the EU nations much less than it formerly did. And I sort of wonder, do we get right back into that confraternity? Or you sort of suggest in your column that even if we do that, we're not going to be the kind of leader that we were, say, 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah, well, the world has changed. The world moves on. Trump, yes, he took us right out of our lane. Perhaps Caligula would be a good analogy. Extremely destructive, pretty much across the board. And I don't think we should overlook the very direct attack on our democratic institutions and the way in which the president, until January 20, set about undermining the election from way back in June, just saying it was going to be rigged, it was going to be a fraud. He had this all set up, and he still hasn't used the words "I concede." So the fact that our democracy resisted, that our fundamental institutions have, from the judiciary to the press, a free press, have proved resilient, I think that's critically important for our country and, of course, for the rest of the world. That said, the Middle East today is not the Middle East of 4 years ago. Trump's impact on Europe, I think, was partly to weaken and worry Europe. Europe had taken for granted that a US president would be supportive of NATO, which evidently has assured our collective security since 1945, would be supportive of the European Union, which twinned with NATO, brought us a united Europe, whole and free. And Trump just trampled on all that. So the result is that Europe has been galvanized, and the Brexit, the departure of Britain from the EU, which Trump again encouraged, I think has added to that. So we now see. Hello?
Hey, yeah, I'm here.
Sorry, I got an interruption here. So we now see a Europe that, for example, President Macron, I don't think wants to go back to quite the degree of dependence on the United States of before. He wants a Europe that develops a military arm. He wants a Europe with its own strategic vision. Angela Merkel, to some degree, follows him, is a little more hesitant. But it's not going to be a snapback to what the situation was before.
If I could order up a movie clip right now, it would be Hugh Grant rebuking Billy Bob Thornton in Love Actually, where he's the prime minister and he feels bullied in various ways by Billy Bob Thornton, and he wants to make it clear that they're not going to play this kind of secondary role right now. Well, over here we have multiple problems, and they're problems that you and I have discussed before. But it's worth noting the Washington Post this past weekend just sort of counted among the 249 Republicans in the House and Senate here, asking them who won the election, only 27 of them were willing to go on the record acknowledging that Biden has won. I mean, this is an election where he's, winning by more than 7 million votes. He's got 306 electoral votes to 232 in the Electoral College. And, we talked in the past, and you write in your most recent column about the epistemic crisis. Is it an epistemic crisis there, or is there just sort of actually, let's first of all hear Kelly Loeffler, who's running to keep her seat in Georgia, because she's as good an example of this as we would need.
The president has every right to every legal recourse, and that's what's taking place. But I've called for investigations.
Senator, did you believe the election was rigged?
Look, Greg, it's very clear that there were issues in this election. There are 250 investigations open, and we have to make sure that Georgians trust this process because of what's at stake in this election.
It's sort of like saying that where there's smoke, there's fire when you're the arsonist. I don't even know what we do about a situation like this, Roger.
Yeah, it is very worrying. We don't agree on certain words. One of those words is truth. And of course, without an agreement on what truth is, it's very hard for a democracy to function. As former President Obama observed, it really shouldn't be called the Republican Party, I think, right now. It's the Trump Party. And remember, the 306 Electoral College votes that Joe Biden has is exactly the same number that Donald Trump had in 2016. And then he called it an overwhelming landslide. I think this problem has been with us for a while. I mean, I've noticed going around the country that there were large numbers of Americans who fervently believed and believe that Donald Trump is the most honest president we've ever had. The most honest, because he tells it like it is, as they put it. He doesn't pull punches, and he says what he said he was going to do. The rest of the country believes that the Washington Post is accurate when it says that the president has uttered, I think it's 17,000 plus lies or falsehoods since he took office. So yes, Joe Biden is coming into a country, is becoming president in a country that is fractured and divided to the point that we don't even agree anymore on what certain words mean. Now, Biden is a politician who likes to get out there and negotiate. He's a touchy-feely kind of guy. He likes to be around other people, and he has made a big point of saying, I am going to be the president of all Americans. This is something that President Trump never did. He governed for his base and for his followers. He did not even attempt to draw all Americans together. So it'll be interesting to see what President Biden can do in that regard. I think he has the personality to make probably as good an attempt as anyone can in the current culture to bridging these chasms. But it's very hard when people are being whipped up by social media, when they are going to the media outlets that comfort them in the views they already hold, when the commons, the places where we meet as Americans and talk with Americans who may have different views from us, have shrunk to almost to a vanishing point, and where the notion that compromise can be good for society. I mean, in life, if you get 70% of what you want, you probably feel you're doing okay. But what politician today is ready to say, okay, yeah, I didn't get 100%, but I'm going to go with this? No, it's degenerated way too often into a shouting match. So the obstacles facing President-elect Biden are enormous. Nevertheless, going back to where we started, just having a decent human being, an honest human being back in the White House, that's the sine qua non. If we don't have that, we're not going anywhere. If we have that, perhaps slowly, gradually, we might see some positive changes.
just to stay for a moment and not to discard where you just ended your thought there, but in terms of that epistemic crisis, how does Europe compare? Obviously, European nations have faced their own nationalist movements, and if you get as far over as Hungary, you've got Orban, who's seems pretty familiar. But I mean, just generally speaking, when you look at, I think one of the places you can kind of stick a meat thermometer into this is the COVID crisis. At a certain point, settled science and accepted pandemic practices seem to kind of obtain. It's allowed European countries to turn the curve back down after their most recent resurgence. I mean, is there that constant undermining of fact that we're getting used to here in the U.S. over there?
No, not I think to anything like the same degree, Colin. I mean, there's some disagreement here on COVID and what the right approach was and mistakes that President Macron may or may not have made. But the fundamental belief in, nobody's been suggesting that, you pour detergent down your throat or whatever and you're going to recover. Nobody's been suggesting that the top doctors or scientists in the country have no idea what they're talking about. There has been at least an attempt at a coherent response based on acceptance of science and acceptance of facts. Now, there's divergence on how much of a lockdown was necessary, whether everyone wearing masks is really a necessity, all that kind of thing. But what you do have in Europe, and it's very like in the US, is, here in France, there's a huge debate right now about police violence, whether it is protesters who are protesting over, this violence, who are in the wrong, whether Macron is supporting the police enough or not supporting them. You have the identity politics of the US coming over here. You have a big dispute about, France portrays itself as a secular society, but the Muslims of France, who number about 8% of the population, feel that's just it's something France hides behind, while in fact not treating the Muslim community of France as well as others. So there's all this community politics that has become very fraught. So there are certain similarities, but I think on the issue of facts, Europe's in a much better place than the US.
Yeah, I think in the U.S. it has reached the point where, it's like we're doing a version of our iconic quiz show, Jeopardy, or I guess IQ in England, except that, there's a debate about whether Dakar really is the capital of Senegal, and everybody's opinion is kind of held, in the same regard. Tomorrow, one of the major Senate committees on the coronavirus is calling as a witness in a hearing a Dr. Janet Orion, who is an anti-vaccine doctor, a hydroxychloroquine advocate. It's as if we were in a debate about civil rights or school integration, and we decided, well, let's call a witness from the KKK. We should find out what they think too. It seems to me that our interest in what fringe opinions are has kind of been dragged into the mainstream, and that it's much harder to sort of just disqualify one group of opinions as completely discreditable. You know what I'm saying? I'm just amazed that a Senate committee wants to hear from this woman, just in case vaccines aren't a good idea or something.
Right. Yeah, I agree with you, Colin. I think it was Senator Moynihan who once said, you're entitled to your own opinions, but you're not entitled to your own facts. That era is gone. Today, you are entitled to your own facts. At least that's the way it appears. And President Trump was an extraordinary heist he pulled off. He was an amazing imposter. If you think, and I always think that when I'm out in Colorado or Kentucky or other places where he has pretty wide support, and there are all these people who, religious folk, people who believe the Second Amendment is of critical importance, and their guns are very, very important to them. And they support Trump in very large numbers. Now, what about the facts? I mean, the facts are that Donald Trump is not a religious guy. He doesn't know which way is up in a Bible. He has no idea about guns. I mean, he couldn't shoot an elk if it was standing right in front of him on Fifth Avenue. And yet he managed to project himself with Steve Bannon's brilliant assistance as the voice, that word he used in 2016 at the convention, as the voice of all these people. So right there, you had a political operation that really had nothing to do with the facts. So we have lost that anchor in American society. Now, you could have a long, long debate on why that is. But clearly, the amount of noise out there in our society, the ability of anybody to express a view immediately, and this at the beginning, the advent of social media was heralded as ushering in an era of much greater freedom and a much more progressive era. But in fact, it's ushered in fact, a kind of a cacophony, a volume, accompanied by dramatic economic, demographic, cultural change that left people feeling, what are actually the foundations of my life, and no doubt mistakes too by liberal media, by liberal pundits, by others, but just left people giddied, and there are different sets of quote unquote facts in the country for different sets of people, and that's the reality we're dealing with.
Well, we have to end on a hopeful note because I think your column contains hope, and I would be betraying it. So I was actually fascinated by what I believe was the lead story in the New York Times on Sunday, which was about the distribution of vaccines. And what was fascinating about it was essentially a protracted ethical debate, a debate in which ethics and efficacy kind of were intertwined and sometimes placed in opposition to one another. Should the goal be to minimize death, in which case the most elderly and vulnerable population should get vaccinated first? Should minimization of spread be the biggest priority, in which case high contact frontline kind of workers get vaccinated first? Should an attempt be made to address some of the racial and economic inequalities that have exacerbated the disease in certain populations here in the country, in which case maybe some of those people go to the front of the line? And what I'm realizing now, Roger, is I should have been thrilled to be reading that article. It suggests that we're capable of that kind of ethical reflection, which I don't think I've felt coming at least from the top reaches for a while.
Yeah, I think that is thrilling, Colin. I think all of us feel suddenly there's more space in our heads, right? Mm-hmm. Suddenly the volume's gone down. There's more space to think. Trump was a political genius, is in his way, and he managed just to occupy our minds, occupy the debate in the country nonstop, 24 hours a day for almost 4 years. So there is this space opening up, and there's a lot to celebrate. Look, Joe Biden won the election. Our democracy withstood an assault. The core institutions, the checks and balances, the rule of law of American society is still standing. Donald Trump is going to Mar-a-Lago. Maybe he'll declare a presidency in exile. God knows what he'll get up to. But he will not be sitting in the Oval Office anymore. Suddenly, there is some hope again for the 21st century, and there's some real possibility that the United States is going to become, again, a reference on the world stage for those of us who believe in democracy, fundamental freedoms, rule of law, human rights, all those things. So, yeah, I do think it is a moment when we should be a lot more hopeful than we were at the beginning of November.
Well, you've made me more hopeful. I'll just add with a closing irony for you to think about in the category of you reap what you sow. So one of the places that rich people often go when they want to avoid prosecution is Montenegro, because there's no extradition treaty there. And, in the case of Trump, it's like a largely white population, which would be his comfort level. Melania could try to walk home to Slovenia from there. It's not that far away. She probably
That's
will.
A long walk, Colin.
But do you remember that NATO photo where Trump pushed the
Yeah,
prime minister of Montenegro out of the way so he'd be in front.
Yeah.
See,
Yeah.
you reap what you sow, Roger. He can't go to Montenegro. All right,
Yeah,
thanks
he blew his chances there. Yeah.
No, exactly. All right. Don't burn your bridge to Montenegro no matter what. You might need it somewhere down the road. Roger Cohen, great to talk to you.
Yeah, and you, Colin. Thank you very much.
Okay, Roger Cohen from the New York Times. He's in Paris, lucky devil. We're here in Connecticut, and we're just thrilled to be here, too. My milk has been delivered. That's all the updates I have. We'll come back. We'll talk more about COVID.
Lock you up and throw away the key. For the countless cows who low down double cross you, been bad have you know. No decency.
Well, the good news is we have vaccines. The perhaps more complicated news is that ruling out the vaccines is going to be complicated. I guess I just said complicated twice. And there are going to be bumps in the road. Dan Diamond investigates healthcare politics and policy for Politico. He's been with us before. He co-authors Politico Pulse and hosts Politico's Pulse Check podcast. He's been watching the Trump administration's continued pressure to get the FDA to authorize a vaccine. He joins us now. Welcome back to our show, Dan Diamond.
Glad to be back, and just to say that President Trump has also deemed healthcare complicated.
Yes.
So you're in in uncomplicated territory when it comes to using that word.
But I'm in dubious company. So I don't think there's much question that the first two vaccines, the Pfizer and Moderna, are going to get FDA approval, probably through an emergency use authorization. The question is, how fully is the process going to be allowed to unfold? And there did seem to be some eagerness in the White House to continue at warp speed, to coin a phrase. So give us a sense of how has that gone so far?
Sure. And I just want to clarify, we use terms like approval, emergency use authorization. Those are different. Mm-hmm. And what will end up happening most likely in the coming days is that these two early promising vaccines from Pfizer, from Moderna, will get this emergency authorization, which essentially is a cost-benefit trade-off. And if it looks like they can provide some value, then they can get this special authorization that has been used over and over and over again during the COVID pandemic to rush treatments and other innovative breakthroughs. Full approval, full licensure, that is a more complicated and longer process. So those vaccines probably will not get full approval for some months to come. The complaint, Colin, that we've been hearing from the White House is that the FDA, in an effort to strengthen the scientific belief that these vaccines will be helpful in an effort to try and convince Americans that they can trust what is coming, that they have held out too long and put too many safeguards around these vaccines at a time when rushing with all haste is essential to protecting Americans in a historic crisis.
So one of the sort of the sturdy trees attempting to stand up to this gale force wind is Stephen Hahn, the head of the FDA. So what has life been like for him lately?
I really like the way you put that. Commissioner Stephen Hahn, I think of it less as a tree and more of geography, that he's on an island. Early in his tenure, Steve Hahn, who only arrived in Washington about a year ago, less than that, he was brand new to the administration. He very much bent to what the White House was pushing in the pandemic when the White House and Donald Trump wanted fast authorization of malaria drugs, hydroxychloroquine, chloroquine. Your listeners may remember this episode in the spring. FDA helped make that happen under Steve Hahn, to the chagrin of staff there and scientists. My colleague Sarah Overmall and I wrote, I think it was in March, about how that malaria drug push was wasting time and wasting dollars in the middle of a pandemic. And that wasn't the first time or the last time that the FDA seemed to bend to what the White House wanted. There was an episode around convalescent plasma. There were other moments when it seemed that FDA and Steve Hahn were saying or doing what the White House wanted. There was a moment, though, some months ago when it seemed that Steve Hahn tacked the other way. He went in favor of defending what the career officials at FDA wanted to see. and vowed in a congressional hearing that he would stand up for science. And that has left him with some staunch defenders within the agency who think he's doing right by the scientists, but still plenty of people who either feel like he did too much to make the White House happy early, or now is now doing too much to make the career officials feel comfortable when we should be moving faster.
It seems ultimately that some of this will have an impact on vaccine confidence. And there's obviously a bunch of people who don't like any vaccines and don't do measles vaccines and flu vaccines. And then there's another group of people who, partly, I think, because of their own suspicion of the Trump administration and the warp speed name, which suggested rushing past stop signs, are maybe a little bit more dubious about a vaccine than they ordinarily would be. And it seems like if the FDA doesn't dot I's and cross T's, that problem gets worse.
Right. I know that's what the FDA officials are trying to prevent, that if you look at people in America who weren't ready to get a COVID vaccine, that number has only shot up in recent months. It has gone down a bit. The vaccine hesitancy numbers have gone down a bit in more recent weeks, but it's still pretty concerning. I saw a poll the other day, something like 2 in 10 Americans didn't want the vaccine. I've seen numbers that are significantly higher. And if enough people don't get the vaccines, well, we won't be able to get to the herd immunity that will best protect us. But I do think, Colin, there was an effort to politicize everything the Trump administration was doing. And in some ways, that was not great by the Democrats. I'm a political reporter. That means I talk to people on both sides of the aisle. And there were things that the Trump administration did this year that got mocked, that were said to be wrong. But at the same time, I think the White House was in a box where they didn't want to be for all of President Trump's failings. There were many senior officials who didn't want to be not pulling every lever, not trying everything they could. And if you go all the way back to the beginning of the year, President Trump did say, I want to see a vaccine in months. And for making that statement, he was roundly pilloried. People said he didn't understand how vaccines worked and that it would probably take a year and a half, maybe longer. Well, the president was more right on that than I think he got credit for. And I do think once we're past the election, we may be able to get to a point where we're looking at the merits of these arguments and less about the politics.
Let's hear HHS Secretary Alex Azar talking to Chris Wallace on Fox News on Sunday.
Chris, that's exactly what I've done, and I've reassured you and others throughout this process, and that's what's happened. 5 independent checks, independent data safety monitoring board, independent drug company reviewing the data to make sure it meets their ethical standards.
I understand. Well, I understand that, but you got the president tweeting that somehow the decision on when to release the vaccine was an effort to defeat him in the election. You got the White House chief of staff calling in the FDA commissioner and saying, let's get going faster. You may be letting the scientists do their job, but people in the White House don't appear to be.
Well, Chris, the facts just show that the 5 independent checks we put in the system are what are driving this train here.
You know, it does seem as though, it's even a problem for us, for journalists, right? I mean, because we don't want to undermine confidence in the vaccine to the extent that it's warranted, to the extent that the FDA is following its guideposts. On the other hand, you can't really blame Wallace for asking that question either. You know, it's hard to see what the right way to handle a question like that is.
Right. I remember stewing over some of the stories we were writing because I was worried about the impact on public health. If we raised the wrong suspicions that were not grounded in the reporting, was I doing my job as someone who covers this issue in the middle of a crisis? At the same time, calling it like I see it, the president has put his thumb on the scale inappropriately time and time again. And the issue of the vaccine makers holding the data until after the election, that was more about, I think, the protocols FDA put into place in terms of how much data had to be collected once they decided that they were going to aim for more safety information before going ahead with emergency authorization. So some of that was out of the hands of the pharmaceutical makers. And I do think that the questions are warranted, given how many times President Trump has sought to make this whole crisis, this whole pandemic, about himself. And if he had just stepped back at times and let the scientists step forward in his place, I think we'd be in a very different position, Colin, on how we trust what the administration is now telling us.
It seems like the next set of debates are going to be about allocation, and I was talking to Roger Cohen before this about some of the kind of ethical quandaries in terms of who gets vaccinated first. But there's also just a lot of problems with logistics. It appears now that they're not going to ship as much vaccine at the beginning in December because of constraints on supply. You've got governors misleading or having inaccurate numbers about how many vaccines they are going to get. I think they put in their request on Friday. There's a way in which there's a lot more uncertainty ahead, and maybe some of the messages that have come out in the last week or two about how pervasive the vaccines are going to be at first. I mean, that creates another level of confusion. You really would like everybody to know the same numbers, the same facts, and therefore have fewer reservations, Dan.
Right. I think one thing that is happening, Colin, is that the Trump administration is trying very hard to take a victory lap on this before the change in administrations, to try and show they're the ones who made this happen. They're going to get the vaccine out first. And as a result, officials like Alex Azar, the health secretary you had a clip from just a few minutes ago, they're all over the news right now talking about the work that they've done. And as a result, that may create the impression that these vaccines are a lot closer to being injected in all of our arms than reality. I, as a relatively younger person who lives in a big city and is not a health worker, I'm not expecting a vaccine in my arm for many months, probably until halfway through 2021. The issue with logistics is a real one, in part because the White House has struggled across the year to distribute supplies, protective equipment, testing for COVID-19. This is an even bigger and more important challenge. Some of these supplies are not things that can sit out. They need to be kept in very cold temperatures, like some of the vaccines that have been developed by Pfizer, for instance. So there is a heavy, heavy lift awaiting the country. The team that is working with the health department is career military officials, essentially. Mm-hmm. And what that means is even when the Trump administration goes in 6-7 weeks, those career military officials will be there, presumably, to have the Biden team step in and work with them as seamlessly as possible.
I mean, it's going to go through all these other political processes at the state level, too. And so you've got Andrew Cuomo, saying, I'm going to get so many vaccines. I'm going to vaccinate your mother and your grandmother and your cousin. I'll vaccinate your cousin. I mean, this is another problem, right? The fact that ultimately this stuff will be requested and controlled and policies will be made at the state level is kind of the history of COVID-19. All the other policies were made at the state level, too, sometimes to the detriment of the populations of those states, sometimes in the case of, I think here in Connecticut and New York and New Jersey, to the advantage of people. But we're going to have another kind of set of 51 patchwork policies again?
I think that's an astute observation. The same problem that plagued that early COVID response potentially will plague the vaccine response. I don't think quite at the same level because there's less to argue about. The states that have said that they're going to do their own vaccine reviews, that's a frustrating point to many that I talk to in the scientific community. The FDA is going to have better data than most likely whatever state health committee that will look over the data too. It's more of a rubber stamp to be expected, but it is going to create a potential additional hurdle in the rollout. I see it partly, Colin, as just the fallout from all of the suspicions that emerged early in the year, with states feeling like they were at odds with the Trump administration, that they were waiting for supplies that never came, or they were getting messages that didn't line up with what President Trump was saying in public. So they decided to go ahead and institute their own checks here. Most likely, the vaccine rollout in the states will be pretty close to what we see at the national recommendation level, with health workers getting it first, with the elderly and long-term care facilities getting it first as well, and then the priority list moving down, including people who are essential workers, maybe on the front lines of police or firefighters, people who might work in factories, teachers. There is a relative order to these things that even if California and Texas and Florida all have some state say, it will probably look a lot more similar than it does different.
Let me ask you about one more thing and about one more person. So I'm driving along in my car and I'm sort of half listening to Here and Now or All Things Considered or whatever it was. And there's this guy talking. I usually listen with rapt attention, so this is just a momentary attention problem. But there's this guy talking, and he's talking about how there's going to be 150 million doses in March and April and May. I think you have to divide those by 2 because it's a double punch vaccine. And then he starts saying, so really by May, there could be some real resumption of normal life in this country. And I'm thinking, May? Really? Who is this guy? Who's talking right now? And I had to get home and look up the transcript. And it was, I hope I say his name right, Dr. Moncef Slaoui, yeah, who's the kind of medical and scientific face of Operation Warp Speed. And I thought, wow, that is a very blue sky he's got up there. It seems, Dan, bluer than what I typically hear from the Faucis and Redfields of the world.
I think Dr. Slaoui, who is a contractor working with the Trump administration, he is a registered Democrat, is my understanding. He's voicing what more people have come to than not, that once the vaccine distribution starts rolling out and ramping up, and we get more shots in arms, things could start to get back to normal more quickly than the most pessimistic predictions. I think Dr. Fauci had talked about third quarter of 2021, fourth quarter of 2021 being the time that he was expecting things to normalize. Maybe it will be summertime. But I have learned in reporting on this pandemic that it is usually better to be skeptical and a little bit more pessimistic than the other way around, so you can be pleasantly surprised. I am personally not expecting things to really turn around until the summer of next year.
Yeah, I mean, one of the people that I follow and pay a lot of attention to, and I'm sure you do too, is Eric Topol from Scripps Foundation, or whatever that thing's called, Scripps Institute. And he said you should think of 2021 as the year of the mask. You should think of 2021 as a year where you will be wearing masks for most of the year. And I think the parenthetical part of that was, and you know what, if it's like less than the whole year, if, by September things are a lot better, then you can be pleasantly surprised. But don't go in there thinking, don't go into this coming year thinking it's just going to be a short run to the vaccine table.
I was listening to interviews with a woman named Rochelle Walensky, who's just tapped by Joe Biden to be his CDC director. And this was an interview that she must have done only 5 or 6 weeks ago. And she said in this interview, she's expecting 2021 to be another year of coping with the pandemic, and 2022, maybe things would get back to normal then. To be fair, that was before the really impressive results from Pfizer and Moderna were reported, where the efficacy rate of the vaccine was extraordinarily high, over 90%. But I do think we've learned from this year that fighting a pandemic is going to take all of our efforts, because this outbreak can so quickly spring up again. And until we have real herd immunity through the vaccine, it will be essential to keep our masks on and to keep our distance and not congregate with people who are most at risk.
All right, we have to stop there. Dan Diamond investigates healthcare, politics, and policy for Politico, co-authors Politico Pulse, and hosts Political Pulse Check podcast. This obviously is some kind of speech test for me to get all those P's out. I think I did okay. Thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure, Colin. Thanks so much.
I see what you did there.
Playfair, this has caught me unaware. Let's stop for air. Please don't rush me.
All right. Quick like a bunny. I got to thank Kat Pastor. She's in the studio making everything work, making everything happen. And Betsy Kaplan, senior producer of the Colin McEnroe Show, producer of this episode, and the person who lined up for us our next guest, and all our other guests too. Kathy Kogut joins us, executive director of the Connecticut Christmas Tree Growers Association. Her family owns Kogut's Hemlock Hill Tree Farm in Meriden. Welcome to our show, Kathy Kogut.
Thank you for having me.
So we don't want to use a word like shortage, because then people will be getting into fistfights in parking lots over Christmas trees. But there is, I guess, an already noticeable increased appetite for Christmas trees this year. Do I have that right?
Yes, you do. People were out much earlier this year trying to get their Christmas tree, putting up their Christmas decorations earlier and earlier. The week before Christmas, many of the Christmas tree farms had already opened and sold what they would normally sell on Thanksgiving weekend. So the rush is on.
Right. So, and we should say that that Christmas tree farms, you don't think in terms of one Christmas season. You kind of think in 10-year stretches, right? When you're thinking about Christmas trees.
Absolutely. Christmas trees are secular. You plant this year for 10 years down the road. So you have to plan accordingly. So whatever you're planting this year, you're not going to sell for 9 or 10 years from now.
And if you start cutting down next year's Christmas trees because there's a lot of people who want them this year, you got all kinds of problems next year, right?
That's the problem. Yeah, a lot of people don't understand that, well, you have trees, why can't you cut them? Well, if we go into next year's cycle or the year after cycle, then your trees are never going to be tall enough when you need them. So you really have to do a cutoff point, and you have to know which trees are going to be available. Plus, there's a large mortality rate on Christmas trees. So even if you planted 1,000 trees 10 years ago, this year you might only have 700 to sell.
I think people also just sort of think, oh, you stick it in the ground and it grows. This is a year-round job, right, caring for these creatures?
Yes, basically it is. I mean, first of all, you have to prepare the ground to plant. You plant the trees. They're planted on a grid, usually a 6 by 6 foot grid. And then, after they grow a couple of years, that's when you start fertilizing them. And then you have to scout for insects. You have to make sure that you trim them properly. The sides get trimmed as well as the leaders. You're touching that tree maybe 20 times before it actually goes out for sale.
And obviously there's been drought and stuff like that that also affects it. So what's your theory? We're almost out of time, but is it just sort of because people are going to stay home more this season, maybe they want a living tree in the house?
Yes, absolutely. The Christmas tree is the iconic centerpiece of the family celebration. So people are going out to get to farms. It's an outside activity. They're feeling safe to do this. And a Christmas tree represents evergreen, everlasting. And I just think with all this is going on in the world today, people are becoming a little bit more aware of how important family is and how important it is to be together.
So are you going to have enough?
There's definitely a shortage, but the shortage is more of a limited supply. There's trees out there, just you might not be able to get the exact tree that you want. There's so many different varieties, so you might not be able to get the one that you had your heart set on, but there's definitely trees out there.
All right, and if you're buying it this early in the season, you've got to remember to keep it watered, right?
It's most important this year because we did experience a drought this summer, so the trees will need to be hydrated constantly. You can never let water run out of that stand. Otherwise, they seal off, and then they won't drink any more water. Some trees will drink water immediately and then stop, but then start all over again. Some trees don't drink any water in the beginning, and then all of a sudden the stand is dry. So you really have to make it a ritual. When you pour your cup of coffee in the morning, go check your tree.
Right. Get to know your Christmas tree. Kathy Kogut, keep yourself hydrated, keep your trees hydrated. It's everybody just needs to be healthy and fully watered here. Thank you for joining us here on our show today.
And thank you for having me.
Kathy Kogut, Executive Director of the Connecticut Christmas Tree Growers Association, and her family owns Kogut's Hemlock Hill Tree Farm in Meriden. All right, we're done. This was fun. And Declan didn't bite the milkman. I mean, overall, I'd say this show is a win-win.
Underneath the Christmas tree.